Good morning. I'm Darrell West, Vice President of Governance Studies here at the Brookings Institution, and I would like to welcome you to the 6th Annual John Hazen White Manufacturing Forum. And we are webcasting this event live, so I'd like to welcome our viewers from around the country and around the world. And I would especially like to welcome our viewers from Taco Comfort Solutions, which is a global manufacturing firm headquartered in Cranston, Rhode Island. The company makes high-efficiency heating, cooling, and air quality systems and operates in many different countries around the world. And the factory there is having its employees watch this forum so that they can understand the important role that manufacturing plays in the world economy and what our country needs to do in order to improve manufacturing. So we will be archiving the video for this event, so anyone who wishes to view it after today will have an opportunity. You just need to go to our website at brookings.edu. We also have set up a Twitter feed at #USMFG. That's #USMFG. And you can also follow at BrookingsGov if you wish to post comments during the forum. We have several distinguished guests here with us this morning. Our benefactor, John Hazen White, is here, along with his wife, Liz, and sons, John and Ben. Johnny is the chairman and owner of Taco. We would also like to welcome Will Vanderweel, who is the CEO and president of Taco. And Johnny and his company have been very generous in making this forum possible. And this event continues our long association with the White family, which dates back over 25 years. And today, we are making a new addition to our collaboration. We're pleased to announce that Johnny has made another major gift to support a new initiative called the John Hazen White Global Manufacturing Initiative. And that initiative will look at what is happening in countries around the world in regard to manufacturing, and also what the United States can do to improve the climate for manufacturing. So among other topics, this initiative will address regulation, workforce development, energy, and standard-setting processes related to manufacturing. So we're very excited about this initiative. We're going to use it to support new research and new activities on that topic. And our goal is to use this work to have real impact on the world and improve the situation facing American workers. So please join me in thanking Johnny, his family, Will, and the entire Taco community for all of their generosity. So for several years in this forum, we have explored different aspects of manufacturing. We've looked at the manufacturing renaissance and what has helped to bring this sector back. We've looked at some of the obstacles facing the industry and ways to overcome them. We have examined the previous administration's focus on regional manufacturing hubs and what they are doing to encourage innovation and to create jobs. And so now with the comeback of manufacturing and its move into exporting and advanced manufacturing, today we want to focus on manufacturing under the Trump administration. During the course of the forum, we will look at several different questions. Such as what is President Trump doing to advance manufacturing as well as his broader economic agenda? What policies will ensure economic growth in the midst of a complicated geopolitical and international environment? Will some of the president's manufacturing policies spur job growth and cultivate a strong American economy? And what do Republican and Democratic leaders offer as potential solutions to provide economic security for ordinary Americans? So this morning, we have a great program that will examine these as well as other questions about the Trump administration. Our first panel will discuss some of the new initiatives and policies that we're seeing from the administration. After that, we will have panels that discuss changes in the manufacturing industry domestically, as well as what the situation is abroad, how other countries are trying to advance manufacturing, and what is going on in the global arena. So to help us understand what is happening, we have three distinguished experts. Tim Appel is a reporter for Reuters, where he reports on issues related to economics and manufacturing. He's also a research affiliate for MIT's Initiative on the Digital Economy. He started his writing career as a Christian Science Monitor reporter and then later became chief economics correspondent at the Wall Street Journal. Michelle Jamrisco is a reporter at Bloomberg News, where she focuses on the economy. She's written a lot about U.S. manufacturing, the labor market, and the health of the U.S. economy, especially under the new administration. And then Nancy Marshall-Genzer is a senior reporter at Marketplace. She's reported on many of Washington's current events. She has worked both at National Public Radio as well as NBC Radio and Television. She's a recipient of the American Medical Writers Association Award for her efforts on America's most profitable drug companies, and so she's written extensively about some of the topics that we'll be covering today. So I want to start with Tim. So in a recent Reuters article, you discussed Trump's appeal in the small city of Elkhart, Indiana. And you wrote that, quote, "The problem for many workers here is one of quality, not quantity." So how is the Trump administration trying to provide both more jobs and better jobs?
Well, I think that one of the biggest changes we've seen has been a look at what the nature of the jobs that are being created. There's always one of the things that the Obama administration and prior administrations have emphasized is the need for manufacturing jobs. The Obama administration famously promised to create 1 million manufacturing jobs, and it was really about numbers. What's interesting now is that through the presidential campaign, there's been an actual discussion of what kind of jobs have been lost and what kind of jobs have been added. And I think Elkhart was an interesting place to look at this because it truly is a place where there are plenty of manufacturing jobs. They just aren't necessarily the manufacturing jobs that a lot of people think of when they hear about good manufacturing jobs. I'm thinking of places where they build a new auto plant and thousands of people will apply for a few hundred jobs. There's
louder, please.
Oh, okay. Sorry. There are a lot of places where there are plentiful jobs, but they aren't necessarily the jobs that people have become accustomed to thinking of as good manufacturing jobs. A lot of those disappeared during the downturns of the 1980s and into the 90s with the restructuring of the economy and offshoring. Elkhart is a place where it has a very deeply rooted domestic industry because that's where most recreational vehicles are produced in North America, so they have a very strong industrial base. It just is a place where there's a lot of frustration among voters there, and I think one of the things that's come out in this campaign was that just creating jobs isn't enough. There have to be jobs that people feel are career paths that are secure, that offer middle-class benefits and lifestyle, and that's the real challenge of the prior administration and this administration, because the nature of global competition is particularly strong in manufacturing. It's the true nature of the business is that it has to compete globally, and that makes it very difficult to create the kind of jobs that people think of traditionally from the 1950s and 60s, of jobs that didn't require a lot of training but still provided good incomes. Now people need to have a much higher level of capability, a much higher level of training for many of the best jobs. And I think that going forward is probably the biggest challenge that this administration faces, is that they've raised a lot of expectations that good jobs will come back. What the missing pieces are: where are those people going to be coming from? How are they being trained? Who's going to pay for that? And how will the regulatory environment and the tax environment support those kind of changes?
Okay. So, Michelle, you've written extensively about Trump's policies. So how would you describe the president's basic approach on manufacturing as well as the economy in general?
Well, when you talk about manufacturing and his strategy toward the industry as well as across the U.S. economy, you have to start from the premise of winners and losers. I mean, we heard this a lot on the campaign. We continue to hear this from President Trump. And that is really at the core of his message on manufacturing. We have lost for so many decades, and now we're going to win again. And he uses this as a sort of premise that he uses to start out with the trade policy. So trade is really the playing field on which we have lost. And this is how he started, from the very beginning of his term. He fulfilled his promise on withdrawing from TPP, checked that box. That was an easy win for him. And then from there moves on to other winning and losing. So he's really started from trade policy and wants to extend into infrastructure and tax reform. But on trade, after TPP, he's kind of moving into a sort of, let's bilaterally kind of negotiate a lot of different trade deals, get some wins. Of course, deal is something that you hear a lot from him as well. So we'll see, especially with South Korea coming up. He's talked about negotiating with other countries. He's trying to kind of jawbone not just companies, which is a whole other avenue for him, but countries too, into kind of getting better deals. So this has been, it's still early, it's a little bit untested, but this is at the kind of core of his economic message. Is trade is where we have lost. We have lost in manufacturing, we've lost jobs, as Tim has talked about. We need to kind of up the quality, we need to retrain the workforce, but not an easy thing to do, across the board. So he's talked, the rhetorical strategy has been number one, as opposed to maybe some previous presidents, but he's certainly moving into some other policy measures. We'll see also how he uses pressure via protectionist measures, perhaps. We have proposed steel tariffs, or at least consideration of steel tariffs in order. Others have said that's unwise, that the economic consequences would be largely negative from both sides of the aisle. We see people advising against that. So we'll see where that takes us, but there are certainly some other measures as well that the Trump administration is exploring. There's a committee on foreign investment in the U.S., a very powerful tool that the president can use to kind of block some investment in the U.S. So there's different ways that they can pressure countries and companies as well to kind of move toward a sort of what they call a winning strategy. So we'll see how these things play out, but certainly across the board, a much more different change, and definitely a change in tone from the previous administration, but certainly one of we're going to win again.
Okay. So Nancy, you covered a recent investment conference where the Trump administration encouraged states to make their own bilateral trade agreements. So how would that operate, and what is your sense of the possible effectiveness of that approach?
Yeah, it was fascinating. You were talking about bilateral deals. So some of you may have attended this recently, is the Select USA Investment Conference at National Harbor at the Gaylord National Convention Center last month. And there were thousands of people there, and basically it was matchmaking by the U.S. government. This was a conference that was sponsored by the Commerce Department and the International Trade Administration, who invited foreign investors to come in and meet one-on-one with states and counties and U.S. territories, like matchmaking. It was like speed dating. They even had a section set aside with little cocktail tables with numbers on them. So I'll meet you at table 12 at 10:30. Okay, great, and then we'll make a deal. And the interesting thing was how enthusiastic the Trump administration was about this event. Commerce Secretary Ross was there, and he was actually, emphasizing that, hey, we have the biggest delegation ever from China of all places, coming in to meet with our states and our territories, and even counties were represented there, trying to make deals. I talked to the Lieutenant Governor of Idaho, who said, look, trade is so important for us. We have to export our potatoes, of course, and all of our other agricultural products. And these markets are so important for us. And here the Trump administration, President Trump bashing China on the campaign trail, his Commerce Secretary is bragging about the size of the Chinese delegation to this summit. And there was a huge trade floor. Every state seemed to be represented with big booths, foreign investors coming up, talking to them, deals being made. So yeah, I think maybe bilateral is the way that they want to go. And they were very enthusiastic about this summit.
Interesting. So I'll throw out a question, and I'd like each of you to respond to. We've kind of gotten a little bit into it, but how would you compare Trump's initiatives on manufacturing to those of President Obama? So we've talked a little bit about taxes, approach to regulation, trade policy, workforce development. What stands out for each of you in terms of the differences between the two presidents? Tim, you want to start first? Or-
Sure. I mean, I think one of the things that is most striking to me is the attitude and about basic manufacturing jobs. And Elkhart is a perfect place for that, and it's one of the reasons I got interested in that place. During the last recession, unemployment there hit 20%. It was a place where Obama and members of his administration went frequently to talk about the need to revive manufacturing, but a lot of the discussion focused on bringing in electric car new kinds of manufacturing, and frankly, what's come back there is the old kind of the RV manufacturing has roared back. So I think what the previous administration to this administration differs in sort of the level of skepticism and belief in basic manufacturing jobs. I think there was always a strong thread in the Obama administration of, well, would we really want those kind of jobs? Are they really the kind of jobs of the future? And whether or not that's a valid argument now, there seems to be a pretty wide swing rhetorically toward we want coal mining, we want all these jobs back, and people in these places love to hear it. I'm not sure it's an entirely feasible agenda, but to me, that strikes me as the main shift that we've seen so far, since there's not really been any much substantive happen. This is more about the rhetoric.
Okay, Michelle?
Well, I think certainly one area where they differ, and they may have had the same goals, Presidents Obama and Trump, they may have had the same goals in advancing the workforce, but definitely a very different style and strategy. So one area that I've been interested in is the apprenticeships programs. Under the previous administration, you had a labor secretary who was just absolutely giddy about apprenticeships. He used to go to Germany and he would just, gush in this online diary about how amazing they were at, getting people, young folks especially, into these jobs, and not just in manufacturing, but across the board in different industries. So the previous administration was certainly very enthusiastic about having companies get these apprenticeships underway. I think they ran into a bit of challenges around getting those companies to understand the legwork and get registered with the government in order to get some of the grant money, as well as just the idea that, maybe, they'll train these folks and then they'll go off and do some other job or, what have you. So the apprenticeships, we have, I think it's about half a million registered apprentices in the United States right now, and that's pretty much little change from about 10 or 15 years ago, despite bipartisan pushes for them. So you saw a few weeks ago the Trump administration really pushing for more apprenticeships, but the difference in strategy is that they think, it's regulation and everything else that has held companies back from getting on board with these. Whereas, other folks will say, well, the companies need more incentives. They need, more money, or they need, more upfront funding to do this. They're not just going to throw out a bunch of money, and especially if they're a public company, let their investors judge them for putting this other expense on the books that may be untested. But it really is kind of a different approach that they have toward the workforce, and that's something I think that's going to be really key, especially as the president starts to kind of negotiate these other trade deals. Some of these workers that voted for him are going to be asking, well, how does that affect me? You're still focused on the big scale changes here, but I still lost my job 10 years ago. How do I retrain? How do I do this and that? And one of the big questions in terms of funding is going to be how does the president kind of handle this very trimmed down budget and this approach to a slimmer government spending when he wants to really kind of revamp training and that sort of thing. I think he's relying on kind of, again, job-owning companies into kind of doing their own training, putting their own money forth and investing in the workforce. And, that's going to be a real challenge up ahead, whereas President Obama, whether or not you would agree with it, put forth more government money up front to do a lot of these training programs, these innovation institutes, as we mentioned earlier. So it was much more of a government-led approach, whereas the Trump administration is, again, much more business-focused.
Nancy, what contrast do you see between Presidents Trump and Obama on manufacturing?
Well, I want to talk a little bit about these steel tariffs that you were mentioning. I'm not going to get too much into the weeds, but there's something called Section 232. It's an obscure part of a 1962 trade law that's very rarely used. But basically what it does is it says if the U.S. can determine that imports of a certain thing threaten national security, then the U.S. can implement tariffs. So in February, President Trump asked the Commerce Department to look into this, whether imports of cheap steel from abroad are threatening U.S. security. And normally, Commerce has about 270 days to come up with this report. Trump wanted it on his desk by the end of June. It didn't happen, and the report still isn't out yet. Commerce still hasn't made a determination on this. It's expected later this month or early in August, and after that, President Trump has 90 days to decide whether to implement tariffs on cheap steel imports. And the argument for this is if the U.S. can't make enough of its own steel to produce things like tanks and important infrastructure like bridges, then that's a threat to our national security, and we need to hike tariffs. President Trump has been a proponent of tariffs. He was on the campaign trail, but he seems to be hesitating a little bit, maybe because they were talking about steel at the G20 summit recently, and the G20 participants agreed to come up with their own plan on steel by November, so maybe the Trump administration is waiting to see what the G20 comes up with. But I've been following that very closely because it could lead to a trade war. It really could backfire on us.
The other contrast that I would note is I heard President Obama and his top people talking a lot about advanced manufacturing. Like they saw the future of manufacturing in terms of robotics, artificial intelligence, 3D printing, and other things like that. I do not hear a lot of that kind of emphasis from the current administration. They seem to be more interested in reinvigorating traditional manufacturing as opposed to the high-tech formulations. But I want to ask one more question of the panel, then we'll open the floor to the audience for any of your questions. So I want to turn each of you into prophets. So let's assume we are gathering again a year from now, which we actually will be doing in July of 2018. But if we gathered a year from now, what do you think Trump will have been successful on in terms of his manufacturing initiatives? Which of his ideas will be implemented and perhaps even will be starting to see some results? And then conversely, what are the things that he's talked about that just simply aren't going to happen, aren't going to take place, or he's not going to be successful? Any of you?
I think on trade, we are going to see a lot more bilateral deals. I think the Trump administration is going to continue encouraging states to kind of go their own way. As far as his manufacturing policies, I don't know. I think a lot will depend on tax reform, frankly, because companies seem to be holding, U.S. companies seem to be holding back on inversions right now where they move their headquarters to another country because they're kind of waiting to see, hey, are we going to get this big corporate tax cut? If we are, maybe we'll stick around. But if tax reform doesn't happen or if it's really delayed, then I think we're going to see more inversions.
Okay. Michelle?
I think there is also, I spoke with a lot of folks in the industry, especially before the panel today, and there's also a frustration that the priorities on the Hill were kind of misled. They were frustrated that healthcare came first in terms of the the Trump strategy on the Hill. And, you know, as Nancy mentioned, tax reform is a big component of this. Tax is very much intertwined with the Trump strategy toward getting corporations to feel much more comfortable spending, investing, in their own workforce and training. So that was a big part of it. But the other big elephant in the room we talked about, I think we just touched on infrastructure. That's another big bipartisan push. I mean, you know, all three of the main presidential candidates were really pushing infrastructure packages. And that could be a real opportunity to kind of fill in the gaps on some people who feel that they've been left behind in the global economy. So in terms of compensating those workers that are still kind of left out of these trade deals, or even with successful trade deals coming up and bilateral talks, a very much more closer to home infrastructure package might help kind of get people on board, people across the country on board with the Trump strategy. So I don't know that a year from now we'll be saying that that's passed and approved and done, but I think early next year at least might be part of the conversation if they can move on taxes a little bit further.
And to do tax reform, they have to pass a budget first. So, Tim?
Well, I'm particularly interested in seeing a year from now how companies have responded. I've been watching closely things like the Korean appliance makers have started announcing finally that they're going to build some plants to assemble appliances in the U.S., and these can sometimes be downplayed as things that were in the works for a long time or not creating that many jobs. But I think it's an interesting reflection of the climate and how companies think. They're not going to suddenly up and change where they make things based on a new president being elected. But if you have the kind of climate we're in, where there's clearly the feeling that there's whatever form it's going to take, there's likely to be more barriers to doing business the old way of just bringing lots of containers into Los Angeles. You're going to see, I think, more of these kind of examples. It's kind of what happened in the 1970s and 80s with the Japanese car makers when there was a big political cloud over manufacturing and what foreign companies should be doing. You saw companies found ways to do the final assembly of products in the U.S. I think it could happen in some electronics. There's talk about flat panel manufacturing, these sort of things which wouldn't have really been considered a year ago, because I don't think that that's the way the larger discussion about trade, as you both have pointed out, just wasn't going in that direction. I think a year from now we'll see whether that part of Trump's agenda is successful in convincing companies to simply do more here for political reasons.
Okay, let's open the floor to questions from the audience. So if you have a question, just raise your hand. This gentleman here on the aisle has a question. Do we have microphones? Okay. Give us your name and your question, and I'll repeat it for the audience.
My name is
Okay, so I'll just repeat the question. Manufacturing used to constitute a substantial part of our gross domestic product. Now, according to the questionnaire, it's down to about 10%. Do you see that staying at that level or ever going back up?
I see it generally staying at that level, yeah, around 12% share of GDP. And mainly because the services portion of our economy is just so large and so robust. And I mean, it's funny because I posed this question a year ago, actually, to Peter Navarro, who's now heading the White House Trade Council, and Dan D'Amico, who's kind of been an informal advisor since the president took office. And they both, D'Amico, of course, being a former steel executive, they both kind of approach this question as, you know, we can really increase that number. And, you know, I asked them about, well, you know, as an economics student, you know, you think about an economy developing from a very agriculture-based society to manufacturing to then services. And as the biggest economy in the world, you would think that we're, you know, very reliant on services. And their approach was very different. They said, I mean, Dan D'Amico talked about how services have been the bane of our existence in terms of creating every bubble we've had for the past 30 years. He said there's a savings and loan crisis, there's the more recent housing crisis, financial crisis, all these things. So they definitely look at our economy as something that could be much more reliant on manufacturing. They look at it, especially from Navarro's perspective, as a national security issue. And Nancy mentioned the national security imperative and steel tariffs. So they're saying, you know, Made in America is not just about, you know, the pride of having manufactured goods here, but about, you know, not having other people, specifically China as a target of this administration, and not having other people make those goods for us, which could create some security issues. So I think their approach is, yes, we can push that and should push that share higher. But I think from an economist perspective and from others, we're much more reliant on services now, and there's no kind of putting that genie back in the bottle. It's very hard to kind of reverse that, and it's a big question as whether we want to.
In the back, the gentleman on the aisle. There's a microphone coming up right behind you. So if you can give us your name and organization.
Great. Andrew Stetner with the Century Foundation. I was wondering if any of the panelists were surprised by the Trump budget and zeroing out the Manufacturing Extension Partnership, which works with small and medium enterprises, and reducing the Manufacturing USA Institutes. It kind of goes to the comment on this kind of different approach that seems to be taken.
Well, I mean, I didn't find it surprising only because those initiatives have kind of been in the crosshairs of a very powerful part of the political scene here in Washington, going back even under the previous administration. I mean, it's always been a fight to keep those initiatives funded. I agree that there was a lot more enthusiasm spoken by the Obama administration about those things, but when it came to funding them, it was a constant battle to actually get them. I think there's a view among some that those are government involved. You know, it's somehow government picking winners and losers. It's government doing things that government shouldn't do, and that's clearly an element that's gotten stronger in the current environment. I'm not sure that therefore was surprising for me. Maybe it was for one of you, but I'd be curious.
I would say it just goes along with trimming government and not filling high positions and just trying to scale everything back and having more of a laissez-faire economy.
I think it was also important that those institutes and Select USA and some other initiatives under the Obama administration definitely had his name on it. So just for political purposes, the new president would kind of wipe that slate clean, and we'll see what, if anything, he replaces it with, other than, trying to convince companies to fund their own programs and training.
Okay, in the very back, standing against the wall, there's a woman with her hand up.
Hello, good morning. My name is Stacy Wagner. I'm a small business owner. And you had mentioned that the Obama administration had apparently pursued advanced manufacturing a little bit more visibly than the current administration. And we all know that advanced manufacturing is really the future of manufacturing. It will require fewer workers, but they will be more high-skilled workers. And I would like to get your opinions about whether, if we take a step back and continue to support sort of traditional manufacturing, does that put us at a risk both economically as well as insecurity, because we're not the preeminent advanced manufacturing nation anymore?
Okay, maybe I can respond to that since I made the initial comment. I'm actually working on a book now about advanced manufacturing as it relates to robotics, artificial intelligence, virtual reality, and the new things that are coming along. I think it's going to be hard for the Trump administration to push back on that, because all those changes are basically coming out of the private sector. Like even though Obama talked a lot about that and put small amounts of money into encouraging it, it's really the large tech companies that have developed that capability. They are pushing ahead. There's going to be an increase in industrial robotics. China, for example, now has some factories that are all robots. They have a handful of humans to kind of operate the control panels, but it's robots that are doing the work. The current administration, the Treasury Secretary was asked about artificial intelligence, and he basically downplayed it and said, in a famous comment that was widely quoted, hey, maybe in 50 or 100 years, this stuff is going to happen, but, we shouldn't worry about it now. Almost everybody in the private sector does not share that view. They're pushing ahead. They see that as the future, and they think there's going to be tremendous impact on the way manufacturing operates. I don't know if anyone else has comments on that.
I would agree. I mean, you can't stop progress. Companies are going to do what they're going to do to keep up. And especially with this Congress, I don't know what kind of policies President Trump could get through to stop that. So it's the economy and the free market. Companies are going to do what they're going to do.
There's a gentleman right here with his hand up. So if we can get a microphone over to him. And if you can give us your name and organization.
Thank you. I'm Dave Rabinowitz. I'm retired. And It's been over 75 years since the U.S. went to a 40-hour work week. Since that time, productivity has increased by more than a factor of 5, and yet people still expect to work 40 hours a week. Now, I remember when I was young reading science fiction stories about the future where things were manufactured by machines and robots, people didn't have to work so much, and it was considered a dream. Today, it seems to be considered a nightmare. What's happened?
Anyone want to respond to that?
Well, I think part of it is we're not really working 40 hours a week. I mean, who checks their email on weekends, right? And as far as productivity, that's something they've been trying to figure out at the Federal Reserve, you know, why it is that we have all these gadgets, these smartphones, and our productivity is not increasing like it did at, say, the end of the 90s. There is a theory that maybe it's more of a distraction, constantly checking Twitter during the weekday or Facebook, that's why our productivity hasn't increased. But I think we're working more than 40 hours a week because we're chained to our smartphones.
There's a gentleman over here who has a question. We have a microphone coming over to you.
I'm Basil Scarless. I lived and worked in Germany a while, and what impressed me was their apprenticeship system, but it was part of a comprehensive approach that involved research institutes to support small and medium-sized enterprises, work between corporations, private companies, community colleges, and technical schools, and it had the support of unions. I don't see that kind of comprehensive approach here in the United States. I also read that manufacturers claim they would expand if they could find the right people with skills. Could you comment on all this and whether there's any hope for a serious apprenticeship program that'll meet the needs of industry here?
I think you've made two very important points there. One on sort of the structural or cultural difference here between us and say, Germany, which is kind of top of the line in terms of apprenticeships. I've spoken with a German student before who was an apprentice, and just hearing someone who's been through the system, you get to see all the differences between a student in the U.S. and a student in Germany in terms of how they approach a career path. I mean, you talk to any basically European high school student, and they already kind of know, some on-the-job training, or they know something about what they will study. Whereas here, it's like, don't ask me what I'm going to major in. Not even in my junior year in college yet. Maybe I'm still figuring it out. So there's definitely a different cultural expectation in terms of on-the-job training. And I think that's one thing that is understood on both sides of the aisle. Presidents Obama and Trump both have faced this sort of challenge in getting high schools to get more involved in this. Community colleges, which was a big initiative under the Obama administration, to get them to kind of promote more manufacturing or sort of manual labor jobs, that they could maybe do internships or other training during high school and then get an internship during the summer, or get a job during the summer, or get hired after high school. So there's that component of it, as well as this whole idea of does everyone need to go to college? Of course, a big debate, especially with student loans being what they are, and that being kind of a scary economic bubble. Maybe we should get more people on track for manufacturing jobs, which actually can be very well-paying and provide good benefits. So there is that debate going on, just kind of on the cultural and structural side. And I'm forgetting now your second point on the.
Well, there's shortages.
The skills gap. Sure. So, and actually another very hot economic debate. Is it businesses not being able to find the right worker, or are they not, offering enough wages? Of course, we've seen wage growth very unimpressive in this recovery. So there is that constant debate of whether or not, the companies just need to ante up and get those workers. So that has been a very interesting conundrum, at least this far in the recovery, to see, how tight can the labor market get? How small can that pool of unemployed get before companies really do feel the pressure to ramp up wages? And at the same time, they're saying, there's just not the same people with the same skills anymore. I need people who can do this or that, and they're off studying something else, or they're off training for something else. So that certainly gets back to the question of, how early should we get these folks in these programs in high school and in community colleges or college or thereafter. And it's a big cultural difference. Someone noted to me the other day that the average age in the U.S. of an apprentice is 29. So you kind of see that difference. And maybe people go back to these sorts of training programs because they have to, not because they want to from the start.
Yeah.
So Michelle, if I could just ask one quick follow-up on that. So in your earlier comment, you said right now America has about 500,000 apprentices.
Registered, yeah.
A year from now, do you think we're still going to have 500,000? Will it be 600,000, 700,000, or what?
Well, I guess I've been in D.C. long enough to be cynical and say, yes, we'll be around that level.
500,000.
Despite the enthusiasm, yeah. I mean, it might go up a little bit, but in a year is a pretty short time to kind of get more people involved in that. And I think, try as they might, I think it's going to take a longer time to get that number up meaningfully. And again, that's registered with the government. So there may be other, I don't know the numbers on apprenticeships countrywide, but they do get, a certain, subsidy of sorts from the government if they register.
Okay, Tim, you were going to jump in?
I just wanted to add one point about the apprenticeship programs in Germany. I first started writing about manufacturing there, so I spent a lot of time in German factories. And it was what struck me, and I think is missing in the discussion now here, is the other side of it, which we used to consider a very dark side in Europe, of when a company makes a commitment to train a worker, there's a pretty heavy two-way commitment there. It's very hard to get rid of a worker in Germany. And that's something that, we used to always think was such a great thing. We had this great flexible economy here that wasn't, bound down by the burden of workers. But if you are a young German, whether you're going to work in a factory or you're going to work in a bakery or any place else, you're acquiring skills that are valued by your employer and respected by the society enough that the companies, by and large, that's changed somewhat in recent years, but by and large, the companies have a heavy commitment to keep you and not just consider you a nice thing to have when the economy's strong, but a cost that as soon as there's a recession or a shift in business. So I think that's one of the parts of the discussion that often gets overlooked and not really, it's a difficult one for Americans to have because of our sort of culture of our business, but I think it's an important part of it.
Gentleman right here, what's the question?
Frank Mannheim, George Mason University. I have a son-in-law who has created a breakthrough self-fueling harvester, and his fate has pointed out to me the huge deficit in manufacturing infrastructure in the U.S. He's found out he has only two choices when it comes to manufacturing his gear. Number one is China. Number two is a large integrated corporation. And the money is also a huge lottery. There is no secure or normal pathway to funding. Government programs are lotteries, and the shark tanks and all this other stuff is very dependent on subjective factors. I'd like to get your view on the importance of this.
Well, I wonder if he's tried the Small Business Administration at all. I know that their whole mandate is to help businesses get started and help, direct them toward financing. So it seems like that would be a good place for him to start.
Okay, other questions? In the very back, there's a gentleman with his hand up. The microphone right there.
Hello, my name is Atsushi Yamakoshi. I'm from Keidan, USA. I'm interested in the implications and the impacts of NAFTA renegotiation on U.S. manufacturing. So can NAFTA renegotiation help U.S. manufacturing based on the current supply chain? Or if you think it can, how that could be realized? Thank you.
Okay, thoughts on NAFTA?
Well, I think that's going to be the one big test, certainly, that I'm going to be watching in the rest of this year is how does President Trump kind of find a win in the NAFTA renegotiation? I mean, I talked about how it was easy to say, we'll withdraw from TPP. It was already kind of politically dead anyway. But NAFTA is the first big one that he's really going to kind of have to own. So we'll see next month as negotiations are kind of supposed to start in earnest. I think there's definitely enthusiasm on all three sides to modernize at least the NAFTA trade deal, and we'll see if he can get some kind of tweaks at least around the edges, around especially autos with Mexico and lumber on the Canadian side, to maybe get some wins for the U.S.
But I think we have to remember that Canada and Mexico are going to be trying to protect their industries also, and they have things that they want. So the Trump administration is going to have to bargain really well.
So one question I have, we spent a lot of time talking about the Trump administration. We haven't really mentioned the role of Congress in all this. So how do you see some of the new initiatives playing in Congress? What are the things where you think members would be more receptive or less receptive to?
I think it's always jobs in their districts. How will this affect my district and jobs in my district? Will it bring jobs to my district? I think it gets down to that granular of a level.
And in a way, the focus on traditional manufacturing probably makes it even a bigger factor. I think there are a lot of members of Congress who maybe not would ever say openly that they've given up on something, but the larger economy might have seemed to have given up on some big employer in their district or big economic force. And now, again, the same kind of optimism that you've gotten among working people, I think would also impact the thinking of congressmen who have a district where there's a traditional industry that is in bad straits and could use some kind of help, either tax-wise, investment-wise, and I think that would attract a lot of attention from maybe a different group of congressmen.
Other questions? Right there on the aisle.
Hi, Zachary Leibowitz, just finished up interning at a lobbying firm nearby. My question is whether, considering that the European Union has indicated that should the Trump administration go through on the steel tariff plan, that they'll start taxing Kentucky bourbon, do you think they will expand the list to include some items that are far more, greater economic interests, such as like airplanes and other high-value added items?
You don't think Kentucky bourbon is of broad economic interest?
That's a big risk, and not just for Kentucky bourbon. I mean, if the Trump administration implements these steel tariffs, we could see a big trade war, and U.S. exporters that have nothing to do with steel could be affected, and not just bourbon, but agricultural exports. And already, agriculture economists are worried about this and are watching this very closely because they are afraid that they're going to get dragged into this, that other countries will retaliate against our exporters.
Just this week, too, Wells Fargo economists were discussing the global economy and risks to it. And where we've seen global growth kind of improve over the past couple of years, they still said kind of casually in a line, after the first few paragraphs, but a global trade war is still the biggest risk to the global economy. So there certainly is that uncertainty. You make a move on one side, and there could be these after effects that are unintended or unclear on how they'll play out. So we'll certainly see if others would take repercussions or take retaliatory measures. But I think the other thing is, especially with the steel measures that we were talking about, there's no certainty that it would help job loss abate here as well. So we're starting to see a lot of people from both sides, again, former CEA chairs from Republican and Democratic administrations say you just can't bet on this as being a win. At the same time, the Trump administration has used this sort of strategy, again, of rhetorical bullying or rhetorical convincing to kind of change people's minds. So this could also be, okay, we're looking into this. It's a common diplomatic strategy. We're looking into this. We might do this or that, and then that might scare people into acting differently in some way on the trade playing field.
Hey, right there. Oh, Is there another question? Oh, over here is a question.
Omar, as in research and development, I'm currently retired. Looking at the future, the Asian economies are supposed to grow at a much larger rate. So how is that going to affect manufacturing in the United States?
Panelists?
Well, I think one thing is, especially now that TPP, at least on our side, is dead, I think one thing to watch is how does the Trump administration fill that gap, if there was one, in terms of getting U.S. exporters to have a bigger presence in Asia and get in on that game. And especially when China is the main target, especially of Peter Navarro, again, the head of the White House Trade Council, who's made a career of kind of, saying, he's got a movie that's called Death by China. He's saying, we've lost to China. China is targeting us. They're cheating, all this sort of thing. But at the same time, now that we're out of TPP, there probably needs to be another focus in terms of getting U.S. exporters to have a bigger presence in that region, because China's moving ahead. They're making waves in terms of negotiating regional trade deals and regional cooperatives that could leave the U.S. out. So there is that risk, but we'll see how that plays out as again, the Trump administration works on the bilateral trade deals that we've talked about, South Korea, again, being one that's perhaps coming up, at least in talks.
And Japan is trying to revitalize the TPP. So that could end up being a very strong trade pact that we would not be part of.
I think also the part of the coming to grips with how the rhetoric is going to play out now is going to be having more people realize how strong Asian economies have driven a lot of the existing strong manufacturing growth in the U.S. I mean, if you're making a Caterpillar machine in Illinois, you think, well, this is going to Chile, but it turns out it's going to Chile to mine, copper that ends up going into something else, and suddenly the world becomes a much more complex place where Asian growth is a good thing for even a traditional U.S. manufacturer.
Right there is a question.
Hi, Max Maximovich, University of Maryland. Going back to something Michelle was saying, if the GDP fraction of manufacturing is going to be 12%, and if we're going to end up getting productivity improvements, which we seem to be getting, then this story isn't going to end well in terms of employment. So could you speculate where we'll be in 5 or 10 years' time with this? What's the end game? Are we going to have much more job programs, or are we going to end up with giving up on manufacturing employment and focusing on manufacturing productivity or something else?
Well, I tend to think it's going to move slowly in terms of the share. Again, I think it's important also to note that when we're talking about manufacturing as a share of GDP, even if manufacturing were to gain, however many millions of jobs over the next few years, if services also gains that many, you're still going to end up with the same share. So it's, in some ways, it's kind of maybe not the best measure of how manufacturing is doing. And again, if we have these sorts of advanced manufacturing jobs as well, it really becomes also more about what is the quality of the job versus, the quantity. Yeah, I would say in terms of the numbers, I tend to think that it's very slow moving. A lot of these, economic gauges take a long time to play out, and to this dismay of presidents who want to make their impact. But I think, maybe we will there is enthusiasm again to get, whether it be, hard manufacturing jobs of the old type or the more advanced manufacturing jobs, there is enthusiasm to kind of grow that industry, but I think it'll be slow, and, again, maybe we should focus more on the quality or the type of job.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question.
Abhay Kumar from Answer. The question which I have is, we have been having a sustained deficit for many, many years, and that deficit has included now advanced manufactured products and advanced technology. So my question is, how long can we sustain this? And if you're not able to sustain this, that means it continues. What will be the effects on our economy?
Okay, that is a good summary question. Maybe we'll have each of our panelists address it.
You know, so much of that is tied up in politics, like everything in this town. Yesterday I did a story on the defense authorization bill, which busts way through the spending caps. But everybody and his brother loves that bill, and they load it up with projects that they think will create jobs in their districts. So I think really there needs to be more political will than there is right now to tackle the deficit. We may see it turn around. Look what happened in the second term of President Clinton. All of a sudden we had a surplus after years and years of moaning about the deficit. But I think before anything can really get done on it, we need more political will.
I actually tend to think that the energy around trimming the deficit is kind of subsided. I think there's so many other initiatives that people are focused on, and you can't have all this and not pay for it. So I think, especially with something like infrastructure, that's going to be, you know, if they get what they want on both sides, it's going to be a huge package, and you're just going to have to run up the deficit. So I think, you know, people will talk a lot, especially at the beginning of a presidential term, about trimming the budget and, you know, being very cost savvy and everything else. But that tends to fall by the wayside when you have other things going on. We have tax reform that is supposed to help, you know, on that side, but tax reform and you know, healthcare to deal with, and infrastructure, and you know, all these things, you know, can drain the budget still. So I'm not sure that that's going to make that much improvement.
Okay, Tim, we will give you the final word on the panel.
I mean, my sense is that as far as when I talk to manufacturers in the U.S., that maybe 10 years ago, everything seemed to be going overseas, and that was driving a lot of what we're talking about in the manufacturing goods deficit. I mean, I'm not sure that we're seeing any stampede to bring that stuff back, but there isn't the stampede to leave that there was. And so I see that as a hopeful sign for this question. I think the political question is, what should we be doing about it? You know, again, going back to the kind of jobs we want to have. Do we want to, as a government, target industries that are future industries and do things to stimulate, you know, at least production in those areas where that would be more of a way to address a deficit question than the jobs question. But I think that's one of the big issues going forward.
If I could just add one thing, because it is also important to remember Trump, the businessman, is big on debt. You know, he once said, "I'm the king of debt." So his style is more borrow now. We'll show the effects. We'll show the success of these programs, and then we'll worry about the balance sheet at some point. And he has been saying, you know, we want to, of course, spend less on these programs and cut this and cut that. But that is an important thing to remember from a business perspective, from his mindset, that, you know, it's not so much let's worry about the cost up front, but, you know, we're going to borrow right now, and this is going to, and I have the confidence that this will yield results.
Okay, I want to thank Tim, Nancy, and Michelle for sharing your thoughts. You've made a number of great comments, so please join me in expressing our appreciation.